Do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe that you can see the unseen? Can objects in our collection shine a light on the existence of ghosts, or at least what Victorians believed about them? The Victorians loved being spooked by ghosts in stories and seances, at home and at the theatre. There was much debate about whether ghosts were real or fake, or whether they could be proved or disproved with the innovations in technology that were coming thick and fast at this time, such as telecommunications or photography. I've got a photograph here that was taken in the 1850s by the Royal Engineers as they were surveying the site around Exhibition Road in South Kensington, London, in preparation for a new museum, which is now the V&A, South Kensington. There's a large chemical stain on the front, which is quite ghostly. But if you look carefully here, you'll see there's a figure of a woman, and next to her, two ghostly figures of women. This could be explained by the long exposure time needed to take a photograph. The second woman would have moved during that period, resulting in the two images of her. Although this would not be well understood at the time because photography was a very new technology in the 1850s. However, perhaps the cameraman has succeeded in capturing something unseen. Perhaps this is a figure of a ghost. What you believe about this photograph depends if you're a believer in ghosts or a skeptic. Spiritualism came to Britain from the United States in the 1850s. This movement was characterised by the belief that ghosts and spirits are all around us and we can communicate with them. This was very popular with Victorian society. I have a watercolour here by Charles Altamont Doyle. It was painted in the 1880s or 1890s when the artist was a resident of a psychiatric hospital then called the Royal Montrose Lunatic Asylum. It shows the artist himself here surrounded by images of ghosts and spirits that are inhabiting his world. The frame for the watercolour was made for an exhibition of the artist's work that was put together by his son, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was the author of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, such as The Hound of the Baskervilles. He was also fascinated by the supernatural and the paranormal. He professed himself to be a spiritualist, a believer in ghosts, and he also believed that modern science and technology could be used to prove the existence of ghosts. Groundbreaking innovations such as the telephone, which was patented in 1876, gave you the ability to communicate with people who were not actually physically there and seemed to make what was previously impossible possible in an almost supernatural way. So it's perhaps not surprising that there was an interest in similarly related elements such as clairvoyant trances, seances and communication with spirits. I've got a copy of the graphic here from 1871, and this was an illustrated newspaper, and it has an article and also a very large image about seances. A seance was where a group of people would come together to contact the dead, and this was often with the help of a medium. The image here shows a domestic interior where a group of well-heeled people have gathered to try and communicate with ghosts. The ghosts are making their presence known by the levitating chairs that you can see here. The image is accompanied by a small article which gives a report by a skeptic who goes to visit a seance out of curiosity. It says that a spirit by the name of John King, a notorious pirate of the reign of Queen Elizabeth, appears. A few minutes afterwards, there were sounds of violent blows as several skeptics were struck on the head by John King's speaking trumpet, and a sofa cushion was thrown at me. Many people from all levels of society were interested in trying to contact the dead, and this is understandable due to the high levels of mortality during the Victorian period. Queen Victoria visited seances both with her husband, Prince Albert, and after his death. People would try and contact spirits for all types of reasons, and interestingly, many people tried to contact the spirit of Charles Dickens after his death in 1870 to try and find out the ending to his unfinished novel, Edwin Drood. The Victorian age was the age of the classic ghost story, which had a real resurgence from the 1830s, and Charles Dickens was one of the fundamental figures in this vogue for ghost stories. Today, Charles Dickens is probably most known for his 1843 novella A Christmas Carol, which features lots of ghosts, and I have some hand-coloured etchings from the first edition here. We have the jolly ghost of Christmas Present, the more spectral Ghost of Christmas Future, and possibly my favourite is the appearance of the first ghost to haunt Scrooge, which is the ghost of his business partner, Jacob Marley. Scrooge, like Dickens, is the classic skeptic and tries to reason away the appearance of the ghost. He says perhaps he has some indigestion and says to the ghost, "You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." Dickens loved ghost stories. As a journalist, he collected ghost stories and reported on them, including his own visit to a haunted house, but he remained a skeptic. This approach to reporting on ghost stories is still with us today, with many popular podcasts and television programs reporting on ghost stories and ghost hunting. Ghosts were as popular on the stage as they were in the dining room. I have an image here from a poster advertising a performance by the Davenport Brothers at the Queen's Concert Rooms in Hanover Square in London in 1865. You can see the audience at the front here. The brothers are tied up in their respective chambers, and the middle chamber houses musical instruments that are played by spirits during the act. Members of the audience were sometimes brought up to secure the ropes tying the two brothers, so to prove that it can't be them playing these instruments during the act. The Davenport brothers were exposed as frauds on several occasions, but they still had a long career and many stalwart supporters, including Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Photography is announced to the world in 1839, so in the 1840s a lot of experiments start taking place. And spirit photography really takes off around this time, kind of by chance, when people start seeing kind of lens flares or blurry things in photographs, even a hair or dust particle, and people start thinking they're seeing ghosts. This is a photograph by Charles Altamont Doyle, who might be more famously known under his pen name Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. This photograph was taken in 1863, it's called The Dream, and it was taken around the same time that Lewis Carroll would have been writing Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which was published in 1865. So we think that a lot of his writing and photographs influenced each other. The story of Alice begins when Alice falls asleep in a meadow and starts to dream about following a white rabbit down the rabbit hole and enters a fantastical wonderland. In this photograph here you see a girl falling asleep and her dreams projected onto the side through the double exposure method. A double exposure is a photography technique when two exposures or two negatives are laid upon each other. So there are actually two photographs in this picture here. It's the same person depicted twice, and this would have happened during the printing process. What the effect does, it kind of creates this ghostly presence, so you see the kind of faded image of the young girl here as she sleeps and dreams. This photograph was taken in the late 19th century at the height of the interest in the spirit world and in spirit photography experiments. The image depicts this dream world, but also someone almost sleepwalking. And this was something that was part of the seances and the performativity around it, people often pretending to be possessed by a spirit or by a ghost and beginning to sleepwalk. So we don't know whether Lewis Carroll was a believer or a skeptic, but we do know that he had an interest in the spirit world, taking photographs like this one, but also writing poems on the subject. He wrote one in 1869 called Phantasmagoria, which is a conversation between a narrator and a ghost. He was also a distant relative of Arthur Conan Doyle, so it's interesting that both of them had an interest in the spooky subject matter. A stereograph is an image made up of two photographs. The left image shows roughly what the left eye would see, and the right image shows what the right eye would see. When viewed through a stereoscope, the images combine so that they appear in a three-dimensional way. Stereographs took the world by storm in the late 19th century. They're a hugely popular optical phenomenon that people could view in their own homes. And we have a modern version of a stereoscope here. Stereographs' subject matter range from the educational to the absurd. So this stereograph here is a photograph by Martin Laroche, and it shows the appearance of a ghost, this clothed figure over here, and it's a hand-painted scene. So the photographer would have then decided what colours to add. Another example of spirit photography in stereographs is by the photographer John Reynolds. He captured this scene called The Angel's Whisper, and on the back of the stereograph we have the full story. So the photograph tells the story of a fisherman's wife who's waiting for her husband to come home, and she is reassured when she sees her children smiling in her sleep as these angels appear and showing her husband will arrive safely. And you can see the two angels floating across on either side of the stereograph here, and they appear kind of in this ghostly, faint, almost transparent image, so we think this could probably be a double exposure. And another example by Martin Laroche is this one here, called Astounding Apparition. And it's a particularly humorous one, and he had quite a satirical style of spirit and ghost photography. So here the two characters are almost shining a light on the ghostly figure that appears. This is the apparition, so the arrival of the spirit or the ghost that's been invoked. And this would have been a particularly spooky scene to look through the stereoscope as it appears in 3D. Stereographs are a precursor for film and television for people to enjoy with their friends and family in domestic settings. Spooky things like ghosts and spirits would have been particularly entertaining for storytelling. As cameras became more widely available to the public and to amateur photographers, spirit photography and capturing ghosts became something that people could have a bit of fun with in their own home. This is an album by the amateur photographer Charles Jones. He was a gardener in Sussex at Oates Hall between the 1890s and 1908, where he took a lot of these pictures. So you see some of the photographs in here are of ships, of family members, of friends, some of the gardens that he would have tended to, and then this particularly spooky and peculiar picture in the corner here of a ghost in the living room. Presumably a family member or a friend is posing as a ghost, perhaps wearing a costume or a sheet that Charles Jones would have given him. This grainy and kind of haunting effect would have been achieved by a long exposure and then having the sitter move to create this kind of fuzzy movement and almost this transparent look of a ghost floating in the living room. Compared to the other photographs in the album that we see of kind of more traditional studio portraiture and family photography, there's quite a lot of effort that's gone into this picture here, and it's quite unusual to see it appear among the gardens, the ships, and the baby cousins. This photograph is by Cecil Beaton. He was a celebrated British photographer. He began his career in 1926 as a society photographer and then went to Vogue, where he worked for 30 years. He was also a famous costume designer and the official photographer for the British royal family. This photograph is called Self-Portrait 1930, and Cecil Beaton was a really playful photographer. He took lots of self-portraits from the very early years of his photography career. So in his 20s, he'd often throw on a costume, put himself in drag, and then take these pictures of himself as well as his family members. And this one's an example of a particularly experimental photograph. We see the self-portrait of Cecil Beaton here. He's wearing the white mask, and then he's got sort of a Jacobean ruff around his neck. And then sandwiched with that is a picture of a skull. So the two pictures together combine to make a memento mori, a reminder of death. So this photograph is almost a development of the 19th century spirit photography. We're now in the 1930s when surrealism really starts to develop. And this isn't so much interested in spirits and ghosts, but really tapping into the unconscious. So, do you believe in ghosts? Have our objects convinced you? Are you a believer or a skeptic? Either way, ghosts are compelling and intriguing. V&A legend has it that a ghost lurks in this very building. The basement has been renamed Clinch's Hole after the warden, Clinch, who haunts it. You'll have to look out for him on your next visit.